I'm experimenting now with a new feature that I found in Zoom, where instead of recording this call and then uploading it later, I'm going to live stream it to YouTube. And it will just record then. I'm doing this so that I will know how the technology works, because Nicole and I are going to host a Christmas Carol sing-along in the coming week or so. And we're thinking about doing that on Zoom and live streaming it. And so this is a sort of trial run for that.
So then you can sing along with you guys then, or something like that?
Yeah, on mute.
Huh. Well, that's fine.
We'll take requests, and yeah, I think
Okay.
probably mid next week. We should get a date in so that people actually know. But you know how these days they go by so strangely and so quickly.
Yeah, they do.
Yes, they do. And yesterday was Nicole's birthday, and so we celebrated her, and
Ah,
yeah. So we might get one or two more folks. I had a couple of maybes from some people, but this being our last time together on this series. So if they come in, they come in. If not, not. But now I'll open us up in a word of prayer, and then we can get started.
okay.
Please don't mind the thunder above me. Those are my children running on this. All right. Dear Lord, we thank you for today, for the beautiful magic of the snow, for the sound of children's feet above me, for all of the new life. We thank you for this opportunity to come here today in this digital space to get to know you a little bit better, to learn more about your history with your people. And we just thank you for this opportunity. We pray that you would open our hearts and minds to know more about you. In your name, amen.
Amen.
All right. So let's see how it works to live stream on YouTube while sharing a tab on YouTube, and see if I totally crash the system. Experimentation.
Better you than me.
Oh, goodness gracious. All right. Let me know if it sounds okay.
Yeah.
No?
No sound.
No sound.
Not yet.
Uh-oh. You should definitely have sound. Okay. Thank you for telling me. Stop the share. Try it again. Share screen. Share computer sound. Maybe that was my mistake. All right. How about now? Can you hear it now?
Hey, friends.
Yep.
Great.
Welcome back. This is the dramatic conclusion of the Space Between YouTube series. For the past 14 weeks, we've been exploring the space between the Hebrew and Christian scriptures in some way, shape, or form. Past couple of weeks, we've been in the time of the narrative of the New Testament. Today, we are finishing this series, and so we are after the New Testament now. At least we're after the narrative of the New Testament. We are in the period of time when the New Testament is being written, however, so hopefully that will make sense to you in just a few minutes. To recap, last week we talked about the social and economic situation of Galilee during the life of Jesus. We talked about how before Jesus was born, most of Galilee was family farms. that had, and small towns, all of these had been in the family for generations and generations until the time of Herod, when the top 1% of the population bought all of the farms and all of the fishing businesses and leased them back to the people that had owned them for generations, and impoverished them and taxed the life out of them, and led to 90% poverty levels. And as you can imagine, historically speaking, when you do that kind of thing, it doesn't go well for the rich people in the long run. And this led to the rise of the Zealots. The Zealots were trying to rekindle the Maccabean spirit, the spirit of the people who had retaken Israel for the Jewish people from the Seleucids. We talked about them a while ago. But they were trying to rekindle that spirit that was maybe only 150 years prior. And they believed that they were living in the times foretold by the prophets, the times of a great liberator, a great Messiah, an anointed one who would destroy the Romans and restore the kingdom to Israel. And this time it would last for more than a couple of generations, because we learned not to make kings and priests one and the same thing. We're going to do it right this time. They believed that if they took the first steps, that God would guide their hands and would strengthen them and give them these miraculous victories, the way that God did in the Hebrew Scriptures, through all the judges and the kings and the conquerors and Joshua, right? So they're imagining this, those stories, those national stories that were so important to them. And they thought that they themselves were living in a time where those kinds of stories were going to happen again. Miracles in their lifetime. Now, they don't seem to be a very organized group, as best as we can tell. They had a lot of splinter groups after some internal disagreements about how violent one should be, I suppose. One of the major splinter groups was a group called the Sicarii. They were named that after the type of dagger that they carried around with them. They were extremist assassins known for killing prominent Jewish people, maybe a high priest even, Romans and wealthy people. You can imagine them, they were too violent even for the Zealots, in the way that, like, ISIS is too violent for Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda too violent for the Taliban, that we would think of them all as extremist groups, but within themselves, they see themselves as like, whoa, that's too much. We don't go there. So these minor conflicts with the Zealot groups, the Sicarii, the other groups, and Romans and prominent Jewish people kind of flared up here and there during the life of Jesus, and then afterwards as well. And it really came to a head in 66 AD, when it turned into all-out war. And the Romans first came in and they conquered the land of Galilee first. And they sent tens of thousands of refugees south into Jerusalem. And we read that at least 100,000 people in Galilee were killed or sold into slavery. And Galilee is not a heavily populated area. It's farming towns. It's like the Kansas of Israel. And so that's a lot of people. And so the Romans then worked their way south, hitting every single major city and population center, which sent refugees south, and more refugees south, and more refugees south. They were intentionally saving Jerusalem for last, because they wanted it to be a place of desperation where all the refugees were, to cause chaos and hunger and to stretch their resources thin. This was all a part of Roman strategy, just in general as well. They were very good at conquering people, which is a horrible legacy to have. But, you know, Romans, what are you going to do? So at the time that the Romans got to Jerusalem and they sieged the city, it was overflowing with refugees from the various cities and suburbs and rural places, and all of the rebels from those places, and all of the various rebel factions. And now, I don't know how familiar you are with ancient warfare, but a siege was when an army would surround a city, cut off its transportation, its communication, and its ability to receive resources from the farmlands out and about, and basically tried to starve them out of the city. And so there wasn't a whole lot of fighting at this point, aside from a few skirmishes here and there. But it was just a long and protracted period where the people in Jerusalem would look out and see nothing but Roman soldiers for months and months and months as the food supply dwindled and as rumors spread about, this and that leader and this and that. And the Romans, meanwhile, just waited for them to collapse. And the Sicarii, being the kind of people who forced people's hands because they believed that that's how God was going to support them, burned all of the food stores and the firewood in Jerusalem as a way of making the people feel more desperate and getting them to fight back against the Romans, which didn't work. It just made more fighting between the different groups. And there was just this internal small civil war between groups of revolutionaries. They couldn't get their message together, their leadership together, and they fought each other inside. In the end, between the internal fighting, the starvation, the pestilence, and then the Roman deaths, Josephus says that there was maybe over 1 million dead in Jerusalem alone, with another 97,000 being sold into slavery. He tells stories of mothers eating their own children, of piles of unidentified bodies in the streets. And unlike a lot of his histories that he wrote, he was actually there for this siege. So he's fairly reliable as to what happened during this war. He wrote a whole book about it, The War of the Jews, which is awful reading but some very interesting things if you're into military history that I won't get into here for obvious reasons. We're trying to get through this. During this time, during this siege, this horrible, terrible siege, there was an elder by the name of Yohanan ben Zakkai. He was an elder in the city, and he was smuggled out by his followers in a coffin and managed to escape. And he founded a school on the coast, which would then be the foundation of rabbinical Judaism as we know it today, because he saw the destruction in Jerusalem and he said to himself, we can't rely on an oral tradition when all the people who know it could potentially be slaughtered in one fell swoop. So he started writing down the oral tradition. This is where the Mishnah comes from. Later, the Talmud would come from that. All of rabbinical Judaism, as we know it, stems from him. To very vastly overly simplify it. So after a long and awful siege of the city, Roman troops finally broke through the wall. They destroyed Jerusalem. They burned the temple to the ground, and all of its treasures, its gold and silver, were carried off into Rome. And to add insult to injury, the Emperor Vespasian used the riches taken from the temple and the slave labor from the people he kidnapped from Jerusalem to build the Colosseum, which, as you know, would later be used to kill Christians. So all of you people who have traveled to Italy and have taken lovely pictures with the Colosseum, I hope you feel guilty now. No, it was a long time ago, but still, you should feel bad. But for the Jews in the early church, this war was the end of the world. I don't think that's hyperbolic at all. To them, this was the end of the age. There is no going back from this. Everything that we've known in the past is over, and any potential for a new world might as well be a new earth, a new heaven, a new earth, a new Jerusalem. And at this point, Christianity was just a flavor of Judaism. It was just the people who followed a particular rabbi named Jesus of Nazareth. The head of the church at this point was still in Jerusalem. The council was still in Jerusalem. All of the Gentile churches answered to the Jerusalem church. The center of the church was Jerusalem. And the church itself was primarily Jewish. So until 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was burned, Christianity was a Jewish sect. After this war, everything changed. It scattered the early church, those who were in Judea. it moved the center of leadership from Jerusalem out to places like Rome and Alexandria and Antioch. It increased the Gentile numbers in the church, and the growing animosity between the Romans and the Jews, just in general, because this was the first of 3 wars against Rome. It pulled the Christians and the Jews even further apart from each other, and it kind of, you can almost hear a pop when the Christians became their own religion apart from their Jewish origins. And within 100 years or so after this, the 2 streams of Judaism which survived this war, the Christians and the rabbinical Jews, would be distinct. They both have their foundations in the Jewish religion, in the people of Israel, the Hebrew people of the Old Testament, but this war separates them. And you get rabbinical Judaism and you get Christianity. So in this way, modern Jews and modern Christians are inheritors of religions that started at the same time, that branched off from the same river at this cataclysm here, except one went in this direction and one went in this direction. We followed different rabbis and we ended up in very different situations. And this is, when you read the New Testament, and it seems in some places to be very anti-Jewish. In fact, a lot of Christians throughout time have used the New Testament to justify all kinds of awful things like the Holocaust and all kinds of persecutions. John himself will write about the Jews in the Gospels as if everyone wasn't a Jew. And the reason for this is that there's this anti-Jewish slant in it is because this is the time period when those books were being written. And so they're being written by people that are just starting to form their own separate religious identity and who are probably trying to distance themselves from the Jewish people because of, the fact that Rome and Judaism were very opposed to each other and the Christians were trying to establish themselves in the Roman world. So, we often talk about Pentecost being the church's birthday, when the Holy Spirit descended on the disciples and they formed the early church. We talk about that like that's the birthday of the church. But in many ways, the church as we know it today, Christianity as a religion, was born out of the rubble of this war. Because, like I said, this war pushed the early church out of Judea and into Gentile territory. And while in Gentile territory, it fully embraced the Greek and the Roman philosophies and moved it farther from its Middle Eastern roots. That's why Christianity feels like a European religion, even though we have a Middle Eastern Messiah. I mean, remember a couple of weeks ago when I talked about Greek philosophy and I mentioned that many church fathers considered Plato a saint? Because they're very Greek. And so Christianity becomes a very Greek religion in many ways. And then fear of the Roman violence moved this early church to codify its own beliefs, to write its own sacred scriptures. And so this is the time period when the Bible's being written, when the letters of Paul are being collated together, when the Gospels and Acts are being written, when many of the later letters are being written. And so these texts are so thoroughly colored by this war that you can see it everywhere. When you know what you're looking for, you can see hints of this war all throughout the way that the story of Jesus is told. And how could it not? Of course it is. Imagine, if you will, that the U.S. and China go to war in 2060. Okay, and it's a bad war, and China nukes Washington and New York, and we lose. So then imagine it's 2080, it's 20 years after that, and you're trying to write the history of 2020. So you're living 20 years after nuclear war, trying to remember what happened 40 years earlier, 60 years earlier. And so imagine how nostalgic you'd be talking about the Washington Monument or the Empire State Building, or Central Park, like how nostalgic you would be describing these places that don't exist anymore. You'd probably get some of the geography wrong too, right? Because maybe you haven't seen it before it was rubble. And imagine how critical you would be of the parties that would eventually cause that war. Even if in 2020 they were totally innocent parties, you might remember them being more malicious than they were. And imagine how anti-Chinese you would be in your recollection of 2020, because you could see in advance the sorts of little things that were happening in 2020 that would impact the war that would happen in 2060. So you would be reading the past through the lens of the present, and that would color how you told the story of 2020. And there's just so much anti-Roman sentiment in the New Testament because of this, that if you know what you're looking for, you can see it everywhere. Take, for example, the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is basically just about how awful the Romans are. Because the book of Revelation is a vision from John being written during the time of Domitian, who was a emperor who was violently persecuting the Christians about 10, 15 years after the fall of Jerusalem. And so in John's vision of this apocalyptic world with dragons and beasts, which very obviously are allusions to Rome, at the end of it, he writes that God wins. He writes that God wipes every tear from every eye. God brings judgment against the beast, against the Romans. And then God recreates a new Jerusalem. It comes down from heaven, and he sees it before him. And it's this brand new city that replaces the old one that just exists in the memory of, in the backs of our minds, which is still rubble to this day. But this new and beautiful and glorious city descends, a safe place for God's people to dwell. And you know what's not in this city? There is no temple in this city. Because there doesn't have to be in the New Jerusalem. Because the people of God are the new dwelling place for God. God can dwell among his people in the New Jerusalem. There's no need for a temple and a separation and all of that. This is the new world that we've all been working towards all this time. The New Jerusalem is not just an end-of-the-world prophecy, the ways that lots of people think about it today, but it's a present possibility for the people who just in recent memory watched it all be destroyed. It's a way of moving through the world in which God dwells among the people and doesn't need a temple anymore, because they're trying to make sense about how to live in a world with no temple, with no Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem is here. The New Jerusalem is made manifest when the people of God work for the common good of all through the power of Christ. The temple of God is each and every one of us. We are the vessels in which God can live and work and move through the world. And the early church really does try its best to live into that promise. Though somewhat ironically, it gets a lot harder for them when Rome goes from being enemy to friend, and when the church goes from being agents of God's kingdom to kings of their own. But this is not a series about the early and Roman churches. That is a different series, I think. In this series, we followed the chain of events that started with the building of the Second Temple after the Babylonian exile to its destruction nearly 600 years later. We moved between colonizing powers of the Babylonians, the Persians, the various flavors of Greeks, the Romans, and then a brief period of independence for good measure. We battled armies of men and battles of culture. We saw the slow development of the Jewish religion and how Jesus seized upon a critical moment to start a movement, a revolution in Israel, a movement that used radical peace to disrupt both the Roman and Jewish power structures. We saw Jesus' followers inherit that movement. that movement which was so thoroughly drenched in Jewish religion and Greek philosophy, and then go on with this strange bedfellows to turn the world upside down. And hopefully, just maybe, this 14 weeks has helped you to see the New Testament in its fuller context. And hopefully, just maybe, it has made you feel closer to the text, to find new meaning in it that is applicable to our world today. I always say that people who think that the Bible doesn't apply today just don't understand the Bible yet. Once you dig into it, my goodness gracious, it is more relevant than ever. Those ancient wisdoms are just as applicable today as they were thousands and thousands of years ago. And so, friends, on this day, I pray that you have a safe and Merry Christmas. I pray that the past 3 months have helped you to fill out the characters in this Christmas story in new ways, and that you hear the good news of Jesus' birth in the same sort of invigorating and inspiring way that I do. And above all, I pray that you find peace.
All right. Well, as always, are there any clarifying questions that came to mind while you watched that?
There were a couple. The final portion, when you were discussing Revelation, I have always felt strongly that the Bible would have been a better text without Revelation. Because to me, what John was doing, it was almost like he was going through drug experiences and chronicling what was happening to the things that he saw during these long periods when he was experiencing some drug reaction. But what you did right at the end, summarizing it and bringing it back into a meaningful context that gave it some validity in the application of what's happening in our world. I thought that was a spin that I'd not heard before, and I found that look at Revelations would more than justify its inclusion, even though I don't like that particular book.
You know, using psychedelic drugs in religious ceremonies has ancient roots of just about every culture in the entire world has some kind of strong drink or some kind of herb that is smoked or taken, some kind of mushroom that's a part of a spiritual journey experience. You know, the famous oracles at Delphi, that was built on like volcanic vents that had this gas that would come up and would give them visions and whatnot. And that wasn't an accident. They built that there on purpose because they knew that was there. The Isle of Patmos, where John was imprisoned, the caves there are plenty of psychedelic mushrooms that grow in those caves. So John was in prison on an island, in what must have felt like the end of the world, or at least the end of the world, because he'd been living through it for some time, and he was the last one alive. So I'm nearly positive that there was some kind of psychedelic influence in the visions that he saw, but that is one way to expand one's mind and come up with some really interesting ideas. Though none of the visions that he shares are particularly innovative. We talked a couple a month or two ago about the rise of apocalyptic literature, and the dozens that we still have, and the likely thousands that had been written, and all the images that he uses of beasts and dragons and horns and vessels being poured out, and all of that is, you can find that in other texts as well. He's borrowing popular imagery, and a literary genre to bring comfort to people. And there's always been people, by the way, throughout the history of the church who have read that book as a future prophecy of the end of the world. And there's always been people who have read it as a present reality, and as an encouragement to hold on that God wins in the end. Both of those interpretations of this kind of prophecy have existed since the beginning. So you don't need to feel like you're being unfaithful to biblical text by going with one of them.
Well, there's another area, if you would, unless Karen, do you want to move in his direction, because there is something I would like to discuss, but I don't want to take up everybody's time here.
Go for it.
Okay. Simultaneously, oddly enough, I think I am kind of a Spong fan, Bishop Spong's writing, and I'm currently, right at this particular time, reading Liberating the Gospels. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he's offering a context of looking at the Gospels at the same time that you're talking about why and how these were prepared, and the context under which it was done. And he's offering a perspective that I'm finding pretty fascinating, and I'm sure that in your studies you've come across it. But what he's talking about is the concept of the Gospels were written and designed as lectionaries, and they were based upon these synagogue lectionaries that had been used on an annual basis. And so that there was a parallel between what was being done in the synagogue and what the Christians were doing in the synagogue before they were thrown out, because they were built around the Gospels, which were designed to take an annual visit throughout and go through the whole Gospel, and end up with the Advent year. And I just thought that explaining it in that light gives me a different way of looking and understanding the Gospels, because I've never heard it portrayed that way. I don't know whether that's common, or is it just Spong doing it?
If you read the Didache, which is a 1st or 2nd century, basically book of worship, it's very much like a practice of worship in a synagogue, because you have to remember, most of these services were happening in synagogues in the early days, because until this war, Christianity is just a type of Judaism. The scandal is that they're letting Gentiles in, but as we saw when the King John Hyrcanus, who forcibly converted so many people, it's been done before where outsiders were allowed in. So it's not totally unprecedented, but it's unusual. But they're just following a different rabbi, Jesus. It's a different rabbi. And so they're doing everything in the synagogues. Paul preaches in the synagogues. Jesus and his people are doing their thing in the temple. This is in the beginning of Acts. The disciples get arrested several times for teaching in the outer courts of the temple. And they're doing all their services the way that they know how. Like if you and I were to be like, you know what, Bruce, we're going to start a new religion. I think we're just gonna make this happen now because you and I we're so spiritual. We got this. The religion that we were to start and the practices that we'd have would look a lot like church. It's all we know.
Right.
And then as our followers take it, and some of them who weren't raised in the church
Change it.
might then change our practices until it looks less like church.
Right.
But I think we would always just default to churchiness.
Yeah, you do what you know.
Yeah.
You keep, and you build on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm discovering a lot, and it's been really helpful and to me the past couple of years of rediscovering the Jewishness of the New Testament. Because a lot of it was written before there was a major split between the Jews and the Christians. All of Paul's letters were written before. To some of the other letters there's some debate as to whether or not some of the Gospels were, like, the first drafts were written before the fall of the temple, and certainly the life of Jesus was before all of that. There's just so much that we can learn about what it means to be a Christian by rediscovering our roots. One of the surprising things that I learned is that Christianity and Judaism are the same age.
Okay.
Because I imagine that Jews today are the same thing as, like, the Jews that left Egypt. And that's one continuous river, and that Christianity just kind of popped off the side at some point. But I am been told by several rabbis and from my own research and learning that is simply not the way that they see it. That I mentioned in this video that there was a sage who escaped in a coffin,
Great.
and he managed to win over Vespasian, who was general at the time and then became emperor, and was allowed to start his own school, and where he started writing everything down. And because he was worried that all of the sages were going to die and no one would be alive to pass on the tradition. And so he starts writing down what would become the Mishnah, which would then be built on, would become the Talmud. And his way, their way, that particular stream that followed that rabbi would be modern Judaism. Rabbinical Judaism comes from his school. And so we don't hear anything more about Sadducees ever again, or Essenes ever again. We hear about these rabbis, these sages. A lot of them were Pharisees, but not necessarily all. And so they have their roots in historical, in the history and the religion of the Hebrew people. But the center of their religion, of the Hebrew people, was worship at the temple. And with the temple gone, the rabbis started to teach that your act of worship is not sacrifice anymore; it's obedience.
Okay.
It's following this set of rules, of teachings, of ways of moving through the world, and that is your living sacrifice, which is a trend that the Bible picks up on as well, the New Testament. And the Jesus people, they said, well, we don't need a temple. We've got Jesus. And so they focus on worshiping Jesus, and the rabbinical folks focus on following the law. And so those two streams survive because they don't need a temple. But all the streams of Judaism that needed a temple are gone because there's no temple. And so modern Jews see their start in 70 AD. And modern Christians have their start in 70 AD. So in many ways, this is this act, this destruction of the temple, this burning down of the city. And then I didn't get into it, but then there's two more wars after this. And then in 130 something, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Romans eventually say, you people are too much trouble. No Jews are allowed in Israel. And so they kicked every single Jew out of Israel. They made Judaism illegal, and they turned it into a Roman city whose name escapes me. And then it would not be a place where Jews could call home until the 1940s after that. Aeola Capitine. Anyway. So that's where modern Judaism starts and where modern Christianity starts. And so we're like siblings. We're like twins that were born at the same time, but followed very different lives.
Not that much different as far as basics go. Being good and trying to do the right things and stuff like that, I guess. Maybe.
All built around the theme of doing unto others as you would have done unto you. Basically, listening to that summary that you just did, Zach, I find that almost a gorgeous way to end the series, because you've summarized some of the most critical points of what we learned in these last 14 weeks. You brought it up to the point where we can see a clearer picture of how we got where we are right at this moment and where we stand at this moment. I could look at the Jews in my life in a different way after hearing what your summary there.
You know what? It's really interesting too, is that so at this split, right? The Christians do this thing, the Jews do this thing. The Christians believe that Jesus is coming back, and Jesus is going to make all things new, as he says in Revelation. New Jerusalem, new heavens, new earth. Jesus is going to come and fix this. The Jews have no such illusion of the Messiah anymore. All of their earthly messiahs have failed miserably. And so they start to reshape what they even mean by Messiah. And instead of looking for divine help in the future to come and make everything right, they start teaching that they need to take it on themselves.
Now.
To do it now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's an old rabbinical teaching that says that if you are planting a tree when the Messiah comes, you finish planting the tree before you greet him. Because planting a tree for future generations is an act of good, and you should do every act of good that you can, even if it's at the end of the world. And so Jews have, in many ways, are more focused on making this world a better place, because they don't have the same belief that this world is going to, burn and then be recreated by God.
I can kind of see that. Because if we're a temple of God, we carry God's in us and we're a temple, then we should be trying to correct and do things to make this world better too.
Yeah.
This was a thing that I had found a couple years ago. The Bible is called the Believer's Instructions Before Leaving Earth. That's what the BIBLE stands for. It's an instructions, Believer's Instructions Before Leaving Earth. So
I've heard basic instructions before leaving Earth.
Right.
I had heard it was
Yeah.
basic instructions before leaving Earth.
Believer's instructions.
Yeah, well,
And that's indicative of how the Christians view the Bible,
right.
because our focus is on the next life, on heaven, on God's recreation.
That's
We
our forever
are
home.
what we call, yeah,
That's a
we are
forever
what we
home.
call an eschatologic, our forever home. Yeah, like puppies.
Right.
We are an eschatological religion, which is a fancy theology word for a religion that focuses on the end.
But to get to the
Eschatology,
end, you have to go
eschaton,
through
the
this.
end. Exactly. And so many Christians have forgotten that because we're so focused on heaven. What did C.S. Lewis said, that so many Christians are so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good?
Right.
Yeah, and so if you are an eschatological religion focused on heaven, focused on getting your soul to heaven when you die, then a lot of the little details about this life kind of fall by the wayside. But on the bright side, you are more focused on individual responsibility and morals, that we as a people are very focused on bettering ourselves. And I think that's worth praising. I'm often too critical of my own people, and I need to repent of that and find the silver linings in us as well. That Jesus seems to be doing both throughout the New Testament, talking about the next life while also focusing on this one. You know, he feeds the people first before he tells them about heaven. Deals with their need now before getting to the need later.
Right. I kind of thought of the Bible as kind of a love story between God and man, because it has all the emotions that people go through. And it seems like God's trying to get our attention. And sometimes he gets our attention and sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he gets angry with us. So it's kind of...
That is exactly how I see the Bible as well. It is a record of God's love story with humanity.
And sometimes we screw it up and sometimes we don't.
But in the end, it doesn't matter, because our sin is but a drop of water on the wildfire of God's love.
Yeah, as many times as we screw up, he's always there ready to forgive us and let us try again.
So here at the end of our 14 weeks, do you have any closing thoughts, any particular insights, anything along those lines?
Yeah, I have, and I know we can't answer the question here, but you put a lot of energy, thought, and planning and work into putting this together. And I'm curious to what is happening in our culture, in our society, in our faith family, that we end up with three people here together. Why is it that more of us, more of
Mhm.
people consider ourselves part of a unity, are not willing to invest an hour a week just to look at and try to get a deeper understanding of the basis for our faith and how we got here. Uh, it, I'm asking basically, is it worth your energy to consider this or continue this kind of thing, or do I have to look at alternatives in getting more people involved in the discussion?
Well, I'm looking at our YouTube channel right now, and I'm seeing on average the Wednesday videos got between 20 and 40 views.
Well,
The
that's good.
recordings of our conversations got between 10 and 20 views of each
Okay.
recording.
That's amazing.
So in terms of like online content, that feels small, but if we were doing this in person and we had 30 people show up, I would say what a rousing success this is. But I also wish that there had been more people on all of these calls.
Yeah.
But I've been so thankful for your continued presence. Karen, I don't think you missed a single week.
I don't know if I did or not.
No, I don't think you did. um,
It kept me
and
sane.
oh, well, you kept writing my sermons, so I had to keep
No,
going.
I didn't.
I always ended up using something that you had said in a sermon. So yeah, I designed this whole thing. Oh, and the Tuesday Lectio Divina podcast, each one gets downloaded about 40 or 50 times. So
So people are
I
listening.
designed this whole fall has been an experiment
Right.
for me. This was an experiment in a multifaceted asynchronous Christian education program where people could watch or listen or download or engage at the time that worked best for them. Tried to do a couple of different ways of engaging for people who engage in different ways, and just throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. And I think I've learned some things. I don't think I have quite the energy level to create an entire new program from scratch again in January. So we'll probably use something that's already made. But my expectations were low, and they were met and exceeded. So I'm happy. Plus, I learned so much over the past 14 weeks. I had such an excuse to read so many books and to like clarify in my mind things that were a little cloudy, and to remember things I'd learned years ago. And I learned so much, and I just appreciate the opportunity to do that.
I enjoyed the lessons because there was a lot of things that I didn't realize. Like, you brought, like when Mary and Joseph went to Jerusalem, I didn't realize what the home life was there. So that was like, I learned a lot of things through this, which is good.
Mm.
And I'm always curious. So that did help. It really did. And on a thing, this coming Monday on the 21st, the Christmas star, Jupiter and Saturn are going to be close together. I think they said this is the closest that you'll see them together in 800 years or something.
Yep.
So, yeah, that was something cool.
Yeah. And you know what? Um, when we talk about astrology and the sorts of things that the Magi maybe would have seen, that's the kind of thing that they probably would have seen. Like,
Right,
wow. So Saturn and Jupiter are
right,
generally in old mythology and astrology seen as signs of royalty. This is Jupiter is named after Zeus in Roman mythology, um, and Saturn, I think Poseidon, right? That these are like the big ones, and so like that uh, planet being in alignment with another one, and
right.
then also if that were rising in the constellation that like symbolized Judea, then they'd be like, oh, so not only a king, but a big king, and not only a big king, but a big king in Judea. We're on it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's winter solstice, isn't it?
And it's on the solstice too. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right,
Ooh,
right.
doggy. Yeah, I'm not a believer in anything astrological, but if I were, man, I would buy a lottery ticket or something. That seems like an important day.
I saw them the other night. They were maybe 2 inches apart. So I
Mm.
think on the Monday, they're supposed to be, did it say like 1/5 of the distance of the moon or something apart? I don't remember how they worded it,
Yeah.
but that's the closest they'll be for another 800 years.
Yeah. And it doesn't get the love it deserves, but Pluto's also there too.
Can we see it?
No, you can't see it, but it's
It's
there in that little
okay.
alignment with Jupiter and Saturn out there being a dwarf planet in the middle of nowhere.
Okay.
Well, all right. Well, it has been a pleasure. Check your emails in the next day or two to find out which date we're doing our Christmas Carol sing.
Okay.
Um, and hopefully I'll see you then, if not earlier on Sunday.
Yeah.
I'd like to express my sincere thanks for the energy you've put into this and the learning that you've shared with us, because I think those who have been able to take part will leave with a different understanding of the Bible and our heritage than we arrived. And I think Karen would certainly agree with that. And people like Jeff also.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. And those videos are up forever and ever. So feel free to share from now until the Google
Whenever.
servers die in the eventual heat death